This is Indian Country Today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. Here are the headlines from Indian Country Today. The confirmation hearing is set for Representative Deb Haaland to become the next Interior Secretary. The Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources will start the hearings on February 23rd. The news comes nearly a month after President Joe Biden was sworn in and nearly 2 months since her selection. If confirmed by the Senate, the New Mexico Democrat will be the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary. North Dakota's requirement for school curriculum could soon include instruction about tribes because of a bill recently passed by its Senate. But the result may solely be words on a page. Senate Bill 2304 underwent an extensive amendment that states social studies and U.S. history must include instructions about Native Americans, but it left unclear how that instruction will be enforced or even how much is enough. The bill was drafted by Representative Ruth Buffalo. She is a citizen of the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation. Her initial legislation was drastically changed by an amendment proposed by fellow Democrat Senator Erin Oban. She says that she wanted the bill to pass, but did not think the original language would be, in her words, workable. As it was originally written, the bill would have required a 4-week-long Native American curriculum at all elementary and secondary public and non-public schools in North Dakota. And the resolution that would have required Utah schools to retire any mascot using Native American imagery failed to pass in the House this week. The Salt Lake Tribune reports that several conservative lawmakers spoke out against the bill. Majority Leader Francis Gibson questioned whether the state was being too sensitive and asked if animal mascots would be next to be the controversial. The sponsor of the resolution, Representative Elizabeth Waite, pushed back, saying that making a character out of a living people is different from animal mascots. Still, the Utah bill was voted down 27-45, mostly along party lines. Even then, the resolution was non-binding and would not have forced any schools to retire mascots. A year ago, the Iron County School Board voted to change its name from the Redmen. And in South Dakota, State Senator Red Dawn Foster introduced a series of amendments that would have included protections for individuals identifying as LGBTQ and Native American Two-Spirit. She is Oglala and Navajo and introduced Senate Bill 166 and 190. Senator Foster is a Democrat representing District 27, counties that cover the Oglala Lakota Nation. The bills include provisions of existing laws that would protect individuals based on sexual orientation and gender identity with specific identification as Native American Two-Spirit. It's the first time the term Native American Two-Spirit is up for discussion in an official capacity in state government. South Dakota law does not prosecute hate crimes based on gender identity or sexual orientation. However, federal law has covered both categories since 2009. As the COVID-19 vaccine rolls out, the long-term health and economic impacts from the pandemic will continue to be felt for months to come. To help Arizona's Native American communities, Bank of America is directing more than $13 million to tribal nations in that state and across the U.S. Recent data shows tribal nations were disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. Benito Almanza, the bank's Arizona market president, says the main goal is to improve racial equality and opportunity. Almanza went on to say that there is an urgent need to invest in tribal and Native-owned small businesses, healthcare, and jobs development. The bank wants to reduce some of the enormous economic and health risks that tribal communities face on and off tribal lands. Tribes benefiting from the funds include the White Mountain Apache, San Carlos Apache, Navajo Nation, Tohono O'odham Nation, and the Pasco Yaqui tribe. Canada's Indigenous Screen Office and the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network are developing Indigenous identity vetting policies. The Indigenous Screen Office was created in 2017 to advocate for and increase representation of Indigenous people in film and television. The organization's executive director, Jesse Wente, says this is the next step in an ongoing process.
hopefully after this consultation, our findings or our policy direction will be adopted by anyone who's doing this similar work, other arts funding bodies, those sorts of things.
The goal is to have a new set of policies in place before the next round of funding this fall. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Mark Trahan. We'll be right back. Who is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation? Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. weighed in on that earlier this month when the candidacy of a descendant of a Cherokee freedman was challenged by another office seeker. Hoskin pointed to a federal court decision from 2017 and to a Cherokee Nation Supreme Court decision that same year that recognized descendants of freedmen as full Cherokee citizens under the law. The rights of citizenship were guaranteed in an 1866 treaty. Freedmen are descendants of Cherokee-owned slaves from the 19th century. We've asked a Cherokee historian to put this story into context for us. Joshua Nelson, a Cherokee citizen, is an associate professor of English, a President's Associate Presidential Professor, and an affiliate faculty with Native American Studies and Film and Media Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He is the author of Progressive Traditions, Identity in Cherokee Literature and Culture, published by the University of Oklahoma Press, and the lead organizer of the Native Crossroads Film Festival and Symposium. He is a co-producer and narrator on the forthcoming PBS documentary, Searching for Sequoyah, and director of The Trail of the Thunderbirds, a documentary in development on 2 American Indian Medal of Honor recipients from the 45th Infantry Division during World War II. Dr. Nelson, the freedmen issue was settled in 2017 in the courts. Why is this still an issue?
Well, I'm afraid it hasn't been settled is part of the issue here. So as I think a lot of people know, it's a matter that goes way back to the 17th, 18th centuries. The question of how it is that the freedmen are to be incorporated in the body politic of the Cherokee Nation is kind of perennially under debate. So I think there are a couple of key reasons why it's come back up. One is that the nation's Supreme Court ruling and the U.S. federal court ruling modified the stance of an earlier administration at the Cherokee Nation, but they didn't go back in and tweak the Constitution in accordance with those rulings. So there's some ambiguity. There are several ambiguities around the Constitution vis-a-vis the U.S. government. So that's one kind of legal reason. There's another cultural reason that I think that the issue keeps coming back up, and that's not least some ongoing animosity towards the freedmen on the part of many folks within the Cherokee Nation.
Maybe go back and kind of take us to the history and how this really began and why it continues to resonate today.
Well, I should sound a note of caution. I'm less a historian than I am a general pontificator, for whatever use that is.
Fair enough.
But my studies are around identity politics and identity theory, and so I'll try to address your question in that way. So, a key problem has to do with how it is that a group of people incorporates a group of strangers into their citizenship, right? And some of these terms are anomalous, right? So back when the Cherokees first start to interact with Black folks or with slaves, they're not a nation. And so the word citizenship is a little bit again, anomalous, right? So sometimes we project these things back and we don't have a clear sense of what we mean. And what slavery meant in the Cherokee Nation was always a little bit different too. So sometimes slaves would be adopted into families, for instance, to replace a lost loved one. Sometimes they were not protected by the clan system. And so, could be more or less killed with impunity. So how it is that you work these people who don't sort of descend directly from you into your larger body politic is an ongoing and troubling question as circumstances change, as you move into a kind of a slavery economy, right? Then it looks like the kinds of freedoms or protections that might have come or extended to the slaves get lessened as the nation is more interested in exploiting their labor than it is in building them into belonging within the community.
You know, this question is really larger than the Cherokee Nation, because really all tribal communities are going to have to deal with identity. And there seems to be this push and pull between citizenship and race. And this kind of really brings this out.
Yeah, absolutely right. So one of the things that I'm most interested in is how in later years, particularly in the 19th century, the Cherokee Nation had all kinds of procedures and policies in place about adopting people into the Cherokee Nation. So, you know, that extended from sort of the local question of marriage with somebody who is not Cherokee to much larger questions. And there were several times and places in which the Cherokee Nation adopted entire tribes to become eventually citizens, full citizens of the Cherokee Nation. And so, you know, you've got these compacts with the Shawnees and the Delawares and others back in 1867. There was the adoption of the Catawbas and the Natchez back in the 1600s, the Tuskegees in the 1800s. And so, you know, when you say, you know, who's a Cherokee citizen? Well, it really kind of depends on when you're asking about, right? And in addition to those larger adoptions or naturalizations, you had people who were marrying in. And so on the censuses, for instance, in the 19th century, up into the 20th century, there were this category of intermarried whites, right? And these people were citizens, like they were voting in Cherokee elections and this sort of thing. That included people from other tribes, that included all sorts of folks. So the inclusiveness under that sort of larger question of citizenship has ebbed and flowed in your historical moments, right? And I'd venture to say that there were times when we exercised greater powers of sovereignty, that we were actually more inclusive than we are today.
Well, in fact, a lot of the discussion have either come down to treaty rights or sovereignty. And if tribes have the power to take in citizenships, that's really the ultimate power of an international government.
It is. And so in some ways, it feels like we hear people kind of making a virtue of necessity around the requirement that somebody be Cherokee by blood. You know, as we know, blood stands in for a marker of race. You know, there's nothing in the blood, literally, that makes you Cherokee, right? So in many ways, we run the risk of replicating a eugenicist logic about how it is that we are Cherokee.
In this election contest, Marilyn Vann is being challenged as she runs for the council. Does this raise issues of double standards about which race you bring into a Cherokee context?
Yeah, absolutely it does. Now, because we've got some constitutional ambiguity here, there may be some folks who just want to see the matter a little bit more clarified officially in the internal documents to the nation. But, you know, there's going to be some question about, for instance, whether adopted Shawnees or Delawares could run for office. There again, you know, a lot of the language from those earlier compacts and treaties is pretty clear. It says that those folks who were incorporated into the nation will have all the rights of Cherokee citizens. And I'm not sure how it is that you make a compelling argument that standing for elected office is not a right of citizenship. Now, of course, it's the sort of right that you oftentimes limit by law, right? You know, you say, well, for instance, you have to be, you know, conscious, right? You can't be in a coma, right, and run for office. And you can't be 4 years old and stand for office. So, you know, there are boundaries around it. But in terms of, you know, limiting it according to one's race, that to me looks like an argument that is not morally and ethically made.
How do you think the Cherokee Nation is, in general, having this conversation, and what kind of discourse is there about it?
That's a great question. Some of the conversation happens on social media. I'd venture to say most of it happens there. And unfortunately, as we've seen in other places, those conversations are not always taking advantage of a wealth of historical background material, right? There's not a lot of room for nuance. There's not a lot of room for complexity. There's a lot of room for anger and vitriol. And so, I think the nation, Cherokee and U.S., is faced with a challenge about how to carry on a civil conversation with greater depth and complexity. It used to happen somewhat in the research, but, people don't really jump to reading scholarly discourse, and I understand that. But I think we would do well to engage in a more robust kind of journalism, right? So, first of all, thank you for letting me weigh in here on your program. This is the kind of program that I think we need lots more of. So perhaps we can figure out ways that we can build it out and insist on, again, some civility in our conversations as we open up new spaces.
Well, we only have about a minute left, but I wanted to ask you, in taking it back to the history again, this is really not a new conversation, really, for the Cherokee or for any other tribal nation.
It's not new. And one of the things that's unfortunately constant in it is I think there's this kind of double bind that the freedmen find themselves in. On one hand, they are called out for not participating culturally in the nation. And then when they try to participate culturally in the nation or politically, people step up and say that they shouldn't be allowed to. And that's a really troublesome way to hold people in a constant state of exclusion.
Well, thank you, Professor Nelson. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time.
And we'll be right back. It can sometimes get pretty busy around here with so many news stories happening. Dalton Walker just recently became our deputy managing editor, and he's had 3 stories posted in the last week. Minnesota City Council gained second Indigenous voice about a man from the Red Lake Nation who just won a special election to the Bemidji City Council. Haudenosaunee Nationals got game 2 about a women's lacrosse team who will be playing in the World Games. And Foul, Atlanta's baseball team, preaches equality about the Major League Baseball team's effort for racial equality that don't seem to include getting rid of the team's racist and stereotypical antics of fans. Welcome, and where do you want to start, Dalton?
Bonjour, Mark. Miigwech for having me. Well, of the 3, the most exciting for me personally, just because I'm a fan of sports, is the lacrosse angle. I really enjoyed that story and speaking to some impressive athletes about what's going to happen and what titles they already won.
I enjoyed that story as well. And one of the things that struck me is we spend so much time on male sports, and yet there's this whole other part of the story that's really important to tell.
That's true, and one of my objectives is to try to capture more of those voices, and I hope a lot more people can do that as well. We already know about the power of the Iroquois Nationals and the men's team. They've been all over the place for the last decade, even last couple decades. And I myself wasn't too familiar with the women's team, but I'm glad I learned about them, and I'm really glad I was able to tell their story some.
I follow a couple of women's sports, and one of the things that strikes me is how you have to work at it to keep up because it's just not in mainstream discourse. How do we do that with lacrosse?
Well, the Haudenosaunee Nationals, they already kind of had a obstacle through their history of the um, Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The women weren't really allowed to play lacrosse. It was more of a men's medicine game throughout the for forever. So they already had that against them. But they kept going. They kept saying that this is important for us. This is as equal an opportunity for us, and we got to play as well. So they've have been able to push along for the last decade or so, and they've been gaining momentum. They have a number of athletes. They have a number of Division I athletes that are kind of part of that whole crew out there. It's really fun to see and to look them up and see where they've come from that early start. One of the key players, she's a goalkeeper, but she's been on the team since it started, and you kind of see where she started at Syracuse back in the early 2000s, and to now that they made it to this World Games, it's pretty exciting to see how far they've come.
One of the things that strikes me about lacrosse, and maybe this is an opportunity, is it's often played in some really wealthy suburbs across the country. And yet in some of the reservation schools or urban schools, it's not on the same level as other sports. Maybe this is the opportunity to get people thinking differently about the sport.
We can hope so. Yeah, it is one of those sports that some would consider a privileged sport, like a soccer, fencing. Kind of, it takes a lot to for your child to get involved. I know from personal experience, I was looking at a program here in the Phoenix area for my daughter on a lacrosse team, and there were so many this small things that kept getting in the way, and I felt bad because we couldn't do it. But I just know a lot of families who have multiple things going on in their life that it's really hard to get involved, especially with this not being like a sport for school or like a club for most schools.
I want to ask you about baseball. Today is actually the day when pitchers and catchers report. So we're now looking at the beginning of a new season. Tell us about the Atlanta franchise and what you wrote about them.
Spring training is coming up, and for any baseball fan, it's the ultimate start of the new season. Spring is in the air. I know the pandemic has kind of dampened that. Baseball last year was a little strange with the season. They didn't even have spring training, but it sounds like they're going ahead. And of course, that brings a couple teams to mind that affect or that have an impact on Indigenous people who have nothing connected to sports. And those two are Cleveland and Atlanta. In this case, the Atlanta Braves team, they made an announcement last week. It was kind of random, but it was a little strange. They announced only on their Twitter page. For whatever reason, they'd announced on their other social programs or their website that they joined a chamber in the city of Atlanta that champions racial equity. And their statement basically said that they're embracing diversity in their workforce and fan base. They forgot to mention the complications with their name and their fans and their chop. So it was one of those things we had to let people know that they're championing this, but at the same time, why not do this other change? And it kind of threw it off and looked at the NFL's campaign last fall when they were pushing their End Racism campaign, and the Kansas City football team had End Racism in their end zone with their giant nickname letters just above it.
I wonder if these teams' management even knows how hollow it sounds when they talk about diversity on one hand and yet cling to these images.
It's interesting. It's always hard to get people to talk to you with these organizations. They often just give you a statement, or they often reference back to their past statements. And Atlanta's always been one that kind of, whenever some group or a native group or someone asks why they don't change or they need to change, they always just say that it's a tribute to Native people and it's not a slur. I know last year they kind of pumped up their program where they were getting local tribes or local feedback from Indigenous people regarding how they could move forward with the nickname and the sensitivity of the subject. I know also last year they decided to remove a chop on sign in the ballpark, and I guess that's kind of big, even though you don't really have fans in attendance. But for whatever reason, Atlanta is a little exception. They're allowing fans, and I believe they probably will once the baseball season. There will be some.
Well, thank you. You've been busy. Thank you for joining us today, Dalton Walker.
Thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world today. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with another edition tomorrow. I'm Mark Trahan.
You got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing rock.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.